Последний пророк это этот. Ну, Дэвид Беккер из этого. Ну, вот в этом мире первого BioShock'а. Вернее, восторга. Чик. Букер Дэвид. Букер Дэвид. Тупое, блядь, самое тупое имя.
Hey, I'm Jeff Keighley here in Boston to go behind the scenes to hear some untold stories about the making of BioShock with Ken Levine and Sean Robertson.
Типа даже интереснее сейчас будет вот эту хуйню смотреть, чем играть, блядь, второй раз в финале.
Let's talk a bit about the theme and setting of BioShock, Rapture. I think a lot of people, when they played the game for the first time, Ken, they wondered, how did you even dream up this place? And I know you've said publicly before that part of the reason you sort of, what led you to Rapture was this idea of fully simulating a place.
Вот этот молодой человек, который посередине сидит.
Это
вот он сделал первый BioShock.
I think our philosophy was always to
Кен
do what we were doing
Левин.
100% rather than try to do something bigger and do it 50% or 40%. So one of the ideas of, you know, and this sort of came from System Shock 2 as well, where you focus on an area that you can really bring to life, and you kind of eliminate the questions of, well, why can't I go over the bridge to New Jersey? So we were able to really make a place, I think, that felt believable and real, even though in actuality it was really quite limited. But we just sort of dressed it with all these buildings outside that were all, you know, were all basically glorified fakes. We let the story drive what we needed to show rather than some kind of like predetermined map which we sat down, which is a little different than like System Shock 2, where we actually mapped a spaceship out deck by deck.
Yeah.
Because I don't know what the philosophy felt a little different there, because you want to feel like a real spaceship that was sort of stacked on top of each other. But Rapture was free to sprawl across the ocean floor.
Although you guys originally, Sean, were talking about doing this game on a sort of spaceship again, right?
Yeah, when we first started talking about what the spiritual successor to System Shock 2 was going to be, spaceship came up, but again, you know, we wanted a limited environment, and we didn't necessarily want to do spaceship again. And our first actual exploration of this space was underwater, but ultimately ended up looking like a spaceship. It just happened to have a couple of seaweed fronds outside. And that started to push us towards what artistic statement that we wanted to make this look different, and what rules we were going to set for the world. How at every turn we were going to try to remind the player that they were in fact underwater and that this wasn't a spaceship.
And how, like, underwater, we obviously know you did underwater, then sitting in the sky, like where did you come with the idea of like doing this underwater?
I think there was probably a conversation. It's like, well, what kind of places could be cut off from other places? Yeah. Like, well, you know, spaceship, summer camp, you know, like any island notion, right? Something that's cut off from the rest of the world. Yeah. So you never felt like you should be able to go over that bridge to New Jersey.
I don't want to apply some deep and meaningful conversation. I think it was one of those ideas that you just kind of say, and then everybody's, well, that sounds cool. Let's try that. Let's go for it.
And I think it lended itself to having very nice views out the window without having to build an insane amount of unique assets.
Right.
By today's standards, we still were a small team back then. And there's an expectation that because you're underwater, the view distances are going to be short, so you can really kind of fade out into the fog at a short distance and not have the expectation that, why can't I see forever? So there's a lot of limitations in a good way that we put on ourselves by being underwater, as opposed to, like, if you're on a cruise ship, then you'd expect to see across the water, and we'd have to deal with that. Same thing with an island.
Or a city in the sky.
Yeah, exactly.
Which was a lot more
complicated.
So you came up with the idea of, let's do this underwater, let's do this sort of isolated place. Then you had to answer the question of, why would someone build this? Is that sort of how it worked, sort of order of operations? You then had to come up with a story to explain?
Меня еще бесило. Меня вот эта вот ультраамериканская хуйня бесила просто. Туда залетаешь, там, знаешь, там такой прям. Вот восторг там как бы там. Красиво как бы там. Похуй. Такая чисто деловая. А там такая чисто американская какая-то хуйня, блин.
I wasn't even particularly aware of the sort of political implications of what I was reading, but I've been reading, I had read The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand, and I mostly thought it was an interesting story. Like, I didn't realize that people were sort of basing their sort of political lives around it, because I wasn't that tuned in to that stuff at that point. And so, but I love the dialogue and the kind of speechifying in it, because you can see a video game character speaking with that kind of certainty and that kind of confident philosophy. It just seemed like a natural kind of thing to apply to this place. And so it just sort of all came together as who is the guy who would do this? Well, you know, that character. He was sort of this amalgamation of characters from Ayn Rand's books and Ayn Rand herself. This sort of idealistic person who says, well, the only way to do this is to separate from the rest of the world. And that led to Andrew Ryan.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone.
We knew from a technical standpoint that we wanted isolation. We also knew to sell it, we needed a compelling storyline, a backstory that why would this place exist? Otherwise, how are we going to make Rapture feel like it's lived in if we don't have the reason for it to be there? So once we decided on the underwater location and then the closed off spaces, that objectivist story kind of came in and made the art stronger and made the level design stronger, because we could feed back into that loop.
And I think that's why we had to have sort of Andrew Ryan's pitch right at the beginning of the game. We wanted people to understand why somebody would go there. And so he makes this very personal one-to-one pitch to the gamer, but also that was the pitch you make to people, which was, you know, there's a place that you can be free of all these things, where you could not be sort of put upon by the government and not be afraid of nuclear war and not be afraid of all these other things that will plague you on the surface. We wanted that pitch to sort of resonate and make sense, because that's, otherwise by the time you got there you'd be like, well, this place is just fantasy, nobody would ever come here. And that the beauty of the place also was also tied into that. It had to be a very attractive proposition, or people who would believe that people would go leave their lives and go to the bottom of the ocean.
I'm sure in some ways you had to convince the team and enroll them in your sort of vision of, you know, who this character was going to be and what the setting was going to be. How did that work, Sean? I mean, did Ken come in and say, hey, I've been reading these books, and I think we could sort of...
I believe he just came in one day on a horse and said, Ayn Rand, everybody read The Fountainhead.
Exactly. I bought 30 copies of it.
Yeah, I think, you know...
Here's a 2,000-page book or something. Yeah. Go read it.
I mean, it really is more organic. You know, like I said, we knew that we had this location, and you struggle to fill it with stories, and you struggle to find meaning of why does this place exist? You know, what's my motivation? And as Ken started to explore Ayn Rand a little more and started talking to us about it, and we were having that conversation, and it's like, oh, this could totally work. Like, this is exciting. Like, this is something that really hasn't been done in a video game before. And if we had flipped it and come up with the idea first before the location, I don't think we would have really been that excited about it. But we had a location, and now we're trying to fill it with that story, and because of the order of operation there, you start to get excited, like, oh, I could totally make this work. This is going to really make it feel like a lived-in space.
You know, as you think of sort of the, you know, the setting, and you think of maybe a character or something, was there a moment that you think back, it's like, oh, like right then and there, like I got excited when you attached the Ayn Rand stuff to it?
For me, it was going to Rockefeller Center and seeing the visual. So I told this story before, but my wife and I were in New York, and we went to Rockefeller Center, which was, if you go to Rockefeller Center, it basically looks exactly like Rapture. It's because every building, you're sort of encircled. It's this block in New York, or a couple of blocks in New York, where Radio City Music Hall is, and where 30 Rockefeller Plaza is, where you see that show 30 Rock, and the ice skating rink, and where they put the Christmas tree. And it's this very iconic location, but what's cool about it, it's all one, unlike the rest of the city. Everywhere you look, it's one architectural style. It's Art Deco. And it's very iconic Art Deco. And my wife and I were there, and we were sort of working on the game, and we didn't have a visual style. And all of a sudden, I started looking around, and I said, oh, this could be a visual for the game. Also, the geometry of it was actually quite conducive to making a video game, because it wasn't overly complicated geometry. Art Deco is quite
bold and simple.
Bold and geometric, and simple. And so my wife and I bought a couple of tourist cameras before iPhone cameras, exactly. You know.
Throwaway cameras,
yeah, throwaway cameras, those little Kodak things, and we just started photographing doorknobs and light fixtures and sort of developed the photos. Remember that? Brought them in and said,
"Come to the office. Here's a stack of stuff.
Here's a stack of photos. I'll see you guys in a couple of years. Go make this."
City where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, rapture can become your city as well.
So you had kind of a theme, you came up with an art style, some of the iconic characters, and then, you really had to build the narrative around it. And you've talked about, a lot of the themes in the game and, greed, jealousy, sex, violence, all the things that sort of, drive us or what destroy us. And that was something I think that, as you thought about the story of the game, you wanted to, I'm sure, reflect some of those, right? Because I think people love the characters that's sort of flawed in a way, and this is a world which is its own little microcosm, but had a lot of tension inside of it.
Yeah, I mean, the character of Ryan was sort of, he's basically invisible through most of the game, right? Except for a very small portion. But he's very present because he exists, the city is him, right? It's such a representation of him. We never want to cut away to a cutscene where you saw Andrew Ryan, planning and scheming. We wanted him to be very present without actually being present. But once you had Ryan, once you had his desire to protect this vision of his, you just had to then come up with the characters who'd be arrayed in opposition to him. So we had this character, the Big Daddy, and then eventually the character of the Little Sister. And so characters like Tenenbaum came along, like, here's a person who's in opposition to him for this reason. And then you have, for more noble reasons. And then you have a character like Atlas, who's much more cynical opposition. Once we had all those characters arrayed, we're like, well, who are you? And, you ended up being a sort of, a pawn in the middle of all this opposition to Ryan. We just kept sort of homing in on that theme and making sure that you weren't, eventually figuring out that you couldn't just be here by an accident, that you're an integral part of this story, even though you don't know you're an integral part of this story. You think you're just there by happenstance.
Look, Mr. Bubbles, it's an angel. I can see light coming from his belly. Wait a minute, he's still breathing. It's all right. I know he'll be an angel soon.
Кстати, Тененбаум. Я когда в первом BioShock'е дошел до вот этой последней главы, я тупо подумал, что реально, типа, вот эти два DLC для Infinite, они будут, типа... вот это бабище, это будет Тененбаум. Короче.
BioShock was groundbreaking in many regards when it released in 2007, though fundamentally it shared many consistencies with Irrational's System Shock series. What elements of System Shock translated into BioShock, and what was refined, altered, and innovated upon to create the world of Rapture? Let's take a look at the long road from System Shock to BioShock. Everyone knows where the game ended up, but I think fans would be interested to learn where this game or the idea of doing this game started. And I think, folks know System Shock and the legacy of that game, huge fan base. Did it start as a System Shock game initially?
No, I mean, because we didn't have the rights to that, right? We kind of felt that there was more game design to mine there. That it was sort of, we did that one game, and it was sort of the first game that really combined shooting and RPG. And it was a very small budget. It was a very small team, and it was the first game we had ever done. So we got pretty lucky, I think, in terms of how well it came out. But but the odds are sort of stacked against it. And the team, was really enthusiastic about doing a game like that. And time had evolved, and the team was much more, we had done a bunch of games together, and we were, we had a stable technology base, and we were like, okay, well, which System Shock 2 was not. I mean, that engine, no game had ever shipped on that engine. It was a very crude piece of technology. Most of us had never shipped a game at the time. So like, well, what if we had a stable technology base and we had a team that was more experienced and more seasoned, and we had, an actual, like our director, and which we didn't really have on System Shock 2. What could we do? And so I think there was a lot of enthusiasm in the team to really try to do a more mature version of that kind of game. This is before we had sold the company to Take-Two, and we were an independent developer, right? We were sitting there, we were using the money we made from other development deals we had, and we would try to scrape together whatever time and money we had to work on this thing. And it was not actually something I was particularly keen on doing. The team was much more keen on doing a sort of a System Shock-ish game than I was, because...
That's what you were pitching, right? Like System Shock 3 at one point, right?
Well, I mean, there was an actual System Shock 3 that we were pitching back in the day when we were right after System Shock 2, but that never happened.
Right,
we couldn't get anybody interested because System Shock 2 sold like 5 copies, right? And so as the business guy, the guy who had to not only just sort of write the content, but the guy who had to go out and get the deals and pay everybody, I wasn't particularly excited about doing this because it was very disappointing when we did System Shock 2 and nobody bought it. It got great reviews, it got these insane reviews, but it left us in a place where it didn't really move the needle for us in terms of making payroll. So I wasn't super excited about it because I didn't see a publisher be interested in it, and I didn't see the audience actually be particularly interested in this kind of game. And it was really the team who convinced me to invest in this because they're enthusiastic. I think a lot of them came to the studio because of System Shock 2. And so finally they sort of battered me down, and it's good they did because I was not the first fan of doing this.
And I know initially there was something called the Serene Dawn. That was a spaceship, or what was that?
No, that was
the name of a cult, right?
Cult. Yeah. That's right. Okay.
That one's, I think, been lost to the... If I remember correctly, Serene Dawn was a cult. You were playing as a deprogrammer that was infiltrating the cult, and your name happened to be Carlos Coelho, who was one of our programmers at the time.
It's named after him, yeah. Then there was a story notion that I always really found interesting, which was that you have these cults, and you have sometimes people who they're these sort of characters who are really live on the edge of the gray morality, which is these guys who come in and essentially kidnap people out of these cults or rescue them, depending on how you look at it. Because what it really is, from a functional standpoint, it's a kidnapping, right? You're coming to an adult and you're saying, you're hired by their parents or whoever. And this was in the story. It was like a senator whose daughter joined one of these religious movements called the Serene Dawn, you said?
Yeah,
Serene Dawn. And I always thought that was a really interesting tension of this hero who's basically a kidnapper and taking a young woman against her will out of the place that she was in. Now, you could also make the other argument that, well, she was not really there by her will. But there's a really interesting conversation that goes on there. I think there was actually a Kate Winslet movie, a Harvey Keitel, Kate Winslet movie, which dealt with a similar theme. Because usually you hear that story, these deprogrammers as a sort of heroic kind of notion. But I always thought that, well, there's something interesting about agency going on there, and about are people entitled to make bad mistakes, or is it a bad mistake? It all depends on the person. And I'm not a fan of religious cults or religion in general, but there seemed to be an interesting discussion of freedom there and independent decision making. And I thought that idea was cool, and that was sort of the basis of it for a while. But it was really mostly for the purpose of we needed something to go out and pitch to publishers, and so we didn't have a ton of time to really develop it. So that sounded like, all right, this will do for now.
And was that pre-Underwater City? I mean, this was just like an idea for a story.
We may have stepped away from that to do the cult thing, but then we went back to the underwater.
No, we had that one room. Remember?
We had the one World War II room with the roaches on the ground and like these weird test tube things that you could walk around. I don't know where that fell. It could have been underwater. There was no windows.
The thing is, we were a small business, right? And we were trying to figure out a way to sell this thing with spending the least amount of money, because we didn't have any money. We don't have a pot to piss in. So we would do this demo. That was one room basically, just to show. And I'd write up a document, and we'd take it around, and I'd fly around the country, be like, here's our room. It was a different time, you know? And
we had just come off of SWAT 4. One of the advantages we had is that we were so familiar with that engine at that point that we could really start cranking through, you know, small rooms and lighting and making things look good. So
I took it on the road to sell it to somebody, and nobody cared. We'd go to a publisher, and look, they have to make money, right? And we'd say, we say, oh, it's sort of a spiritual successor to System Shock 2, and they'd be like, well, how did that sell? And I'd be like, my mom likes it, you know. Yeah. And they would be like, well, we can't, you know. And usually we'd be talking to a fan. A lot of executives, like sort of junior executives, were fans of System Shock, and they'd go to their boss and they'd be super excited, and their boss would open up, you know, their Excel spreadsheet and be like, no, we can't do this. And I think the pitch probably evolved as we kept trying different permutations trying to sell, but we're also out there trying to sell like 2 or 3 other things at the time. We had a pitch for a game called Monster Island, and
well, our SWAT 5 pitch was
Zombie SWAT.
Yeah, we had just come off of SWAT 4, which is like hardcore tactical, and we decided they wanted us to do another SWAT, and we didn't really want to do another hardcore tactical game, so we're like, what if we added zombies to SWAT? Like, you're a SWAT team that fights zombies and werewolves. That sounds awesome. And it was like, no, it doesn't.
And this is before, like before zombies were a thing.
Yeah.
And so we came with this thing called Division 9.
Division 9, yeah.
That probably would have been even a bigger financial success than BioShock. Wow. But we couldn't get anybody interested in it.
We didn't have enough werewolves in the demo, I think.
We had 0 werewolves in the demo. Yeah, we were going to have werewolves, weren't we?
Werewolves and vampires. So it was
oh, really?
Yeah,
werewolves,
the whole,
vampires,
like,
zombies?
just throw it all the Universal Studios monsters from like...
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So what happened was we couldn't sell it, but we were always sort of independent-minded. And so I said, well, what if we sort of did this in reverse? Instead of getting a publisher first and then doing a press tour on it, what if we sort of did the press first? Yeah. And we called up a guy, Andrew Park, who's at GameSpot at the time, who was a fan of System Shock 2 and a great guy. And I said, well, will you come out and look at this thing we're doing and write a story on it? And he was like, sure. And Andrew flew out, and we showed him what we had, which is this very, very rudimentary thing about an underwater base. And he wrote up an article and sort of featured it as like, this is the spiritual successor to System Shock 2. And the next day, the phone started ringing from publishers who now all of a sudden saw the article was getting all this pickup and all these comments, and people were excited. And that really, I think, put it over the top in terms of being able to sell it, even though it was not BioShock at that point. It was called BioShock, but it was not BioShock. There would have been I don't think there would have been a game. We never would have sold it without Andrew coming out doing that.
My belly's full of angel's blood.
One of the biggest challenges Irrational faced when developing BioShock was figuring out a way to retain the feeling of a deep RPG while making the game accessible to a broader console audience. Ultimately, the team succeeded in creating an intricate system of weapon and character upgrades that gave the player choice and customization while keeping the gameplay fast, lean, and engaging. One of the hallmarks of BioShock, to me at least, was that it really blended RPG and sort of first-person action game together in a way that, is sort of standard today, but a decade ago was really pretty revolutionary. And I know for the team, I think at some point it became clear that you wanted this to work on consoles, not on PC, right?
Well, both, yeah.
Yeah. But so the idea of, doing a console game and a PC game, and doing something that sort of felt like a shooter but had much more depth. And I know in some of the early design docs you talked about sort of creating an FPS plus versus an RPG light. What was the difference in your mind between those two?
I think for us is the big difference between System Shock and BioShock ended up being that System Shock was more about your character growth and BioShock was more about the environment. Because with System Shock, we really didn't have System Shock 2. We didn't really have either the art team to make enough assets or the visual power to sort of make a really convincing environment. But as we started working on BioShock, the art team was so strong that the ability to tell a story within the environment became the most important thing about the game. And that was sort of not something we thought right at the beginning. That was not really a concept we had. But as we started building things, we could realize that the visual world was the star of this thing. The rapture was really the star of this thing. And telling the story outside of cutscenes, telling it in the world, so the gamer could discover the story rather than us telling him the story, telling him or her the story. And it was still very much, for the time, I think for the time, quite different than what you had seen in terms of there wasn't a lot of growth in shooters. So it was still, I think, for the time, very, very revolutionary. But I think System Shock 2 was even more ahead of its time in terms of that growth thing, because we defocused a little bit. Primarily, part of it was just figuring out how to do that all on a console controller was very tricky.
No, I remember even the early demos, people like, you see a plasma, you see like a upgraded weapon, people are like, oh, I've never seen that before in a shooter. And that was, when you were coming out of the sort of, the Quake, Doom, Half-Life, where it's like you have, 8 weapons on the keyboard and you sort of knew what they were and they weren't going to change. Yeah. Sean, was that something that, from a sort of creative standpoint, was it always clear that that was something you guys wanted to do, or it evolved over time because you wanted to have more depth in the game?
I mean, it certainly evolved over time, and each upgrade path was slightly, had its own unique challenges. Like certainly upgrading the weapons, you had to design a base weapon that didn't feel like crap. Still felt like something that you wanted to use, but then the ability to add the upgrades to that, and each of the upgrades can come in any order, so you have to be aware that this, parts A, B, and C could come in at any different time to upgrade the weapon. In a first-person shooter, that's your star. That's the thing that you're seeing all the time. When it comes to other things, plasmids, things that are,
Tonics.
Tonics, yes, sorry. It's been a while.
Come on, Sean.
I know, it's 10 years. Those things were more offloaded to machines that you would then have to interact with, so you're not carrying the inventory around with you. But each of these decisions on how we're going to upgrade the player, it wasn't like a mouse and keyboard. Okay, we can just use the mouse, and you have all these buttons at your disposal.
You could arbitrarily point at a part of the screen really easily, which you could do in System Shock 2.
Yeah, so we certainly learned trial by fire when we were trying to adapt these things to the console at the time.
Yeah, and like having different ammo types and stuff like that. Like we went through numerous iterations of the interface to make it. Like we had the first times we sort of put the interface into play. It was very obtuse and very tricky to get your head around, and we just kept working on it and working on it and working on it because you want to feel like second nature. But we spent a lot of time on that.
What motivated the idea of having so much choice in the way you could sort of play through this game? What was it to give the player a better sense of authorship over the experience, or what was driving that?
I've always liked the idea of giving the player a lot of agency in terms of their play style and experimenting with the play style and trying different things and seeing what worked and didn't work and interacting with the environment. The notion that it's sort of a playground that you get to play around with and imprint your own desire on was great, because I think we were more skeptical about being able to do that with story at the time. In fact, so much to the point where that became almost like a joke. That becomes the meta joke of the game, of how little agency you have in your story. But agency in terms of how you play the experience and how you load out your weapons and how you interact with the environment, as compared to most shooters at the time, where basically like you can shoot them with the shotgun or shoot them with the the pistol. That was really important to us. So we spent a lot of time trying to make the world react in a way that you would expect and hope it to react when you tried something.
Right. And some of those system or decisions we made about systems fed back into the narrative, like locking Adam behind Big Daddy and the little sister. Like you can't get Adam unless you deal with the Big Daddy, which then becomes a roving boss fight, which then becomes another system that I don't know if we planned that from the start or was one of those happy, like, serendipity, like, oh, this decision that we made about putting Adam behind the Big Daddy totally works because now we have a different type of boss fight that you hadn't really seen in other games.
Actually, it was the other way, because what happened was originally there was no concept of Adam, and Big Daddy just had money and other treasure on them, like every other splicer. Yeah. And they were so tough, nobody would ever fight them, because why on earth would you go after that guy?
Right, go off a bunch of small splicers and get the same amount, yeah.
So we had to come up with a currency that was exclusive to them, because we knew that was where the fun was, right? But we also knew people were terrified of them, and we didn't want to fight them. Yeah. So video game development and system development is a lot like economics, right? You know, in economics, you try to encourage certain behaviors through tax, usually through tax policy. You know, well, you want business growth, so you lower taxes on certain segments of the business economy, or you want to encourage, you know, people to move into this area, so you make incentives to move in here. We had to make an incentive for players to fight the big daddy, and Adam became that incentive. And then once you had this Adam, then you had a new piece of narrative, which they could then incorporate back into the story.
Yeah. Get old, taste the Adam fucking drink.
Stay away from her, or it is you who will be shot next.
Easy now, Doctor. He's just looking for a wee bit of Adam. Just enough to get by.
I'll not have him hurt my little ones.
Talk a bit about the plasmids and the vending machines and that sort of whole approach to, I guess, what is kind of a tech tree, but, you know, and coming from PC games, you know, used to strategy games and whatnot with very complicated ways of how you would upgrade things. I thought you guys did you had a really interesting approach to how you made it very accessible to a console audience. How did that evolve? Did you know the vending machines were going to be there from the get-go?
Well, we had vending machines in System Shock 2, so we were sort of lifting that, and I always thought that was a fun notion because it's a affordance that people already understand. You know, they see a vending machine, they know immediately, oh, that's where I buy stuff, right? Yeah. And you also then have to have a shopkeep. When we talked about wanting to make things, put limitations on ourselves so things felt fully believable. Yeah. If we had a shopkeeper sitting there, you can't shoot him. He sits there, he doesn't say anything. Right. And all of a sudden he feels fake. Where a vending machine, the Circus of Values machine, can feel 100% authentic. Right. You know, despite the fact that it's selling like ammo and stuff like that, you know, which is,
But in an objectivist society where you don't have rules and regulations on that type of thing, it feeds back into the narrative.
But you don't then break the fiction at all by having these characters who sort of don't really live and breathe in the world. So the vending machines became an important part of that. But we still want to give them character, and hence and so that clown image came from a piece of, that image is actually from like a fruit container or something from like the 1940s. Okay. And so we had a book of like royalty-free images, and I saw that image, and I'm like, let's put that clown on it, and we'll call it Circus of Values. And then, you know, we wrote some lines for it, decided he'd be this sort of asshole clown, and then we hired the best actor in the world to play that part. That was me. What I cost my biggest Avengers, I didn't cost anything.
I didn't know you were really.
I was a clown. Yeah, no. I was a clown.
I hear it in my head every day.
My wife hates that voice. She hates that voice.
You can give us a little of it right here.
Welcome to the Circus of Values. She does not allow me to do that, so I do it outside of the house. Okay. But it allowed us to have something that felt very rich and very real, while being very limited at the same time.
Feel your cravings at the Circus of Values.
And also, you know, the plasmids and sort of the motif of sort of the videos and how you explain sort of what a plasmid was. That was a really fun way, I thought, to sort of explain that. Sean, how did you guys evolve that? Because it was a very artistic approach.
I think those came on pretty late too, because we were developing all these systems, and you make the assumptions because you're dealing with them every day that the player who gets this game is going to understand what these systems are. And we always joke that you can't ship a developer with a game, or you can't expect somebody to have a README file for all of these things. Nobody's understanding what these plasmids are or how to use them. How do we present these to the audience in such a way that they're going to understand what it is fictionally and what it is functionally? Because Rob Waters did a lot of the animations on those, and we sit down and we write out like a little 30-second commercial of what this thing is. And again, because going back to the narrative, this is what would happen in Rapture. People are trying to sell these things, so they would come up with commercials to explain why you need this. Using that as your framework, you can then come up with all of these little gags that people will remember that have a little personality to them. But I think ultimately in the end weren't that expensive to create, because they're cheap.
I think that one of the most important things about it is we didn't want them to be long, and we didn't have a lot of budget for the art, so we have like a couple of frames of animation in them essentially. And so we had to figure out, how do we message how this thing works in like that. And that's what marketing is, right? It's how do you message how something works. And marketing and tutorializing are very similar things, right? You're trying to get a message across in a very brief period of time in a very snappy fashion. And I think that one of the things that I always felt about games is that tutorials are sort of death. And because they're usually like, you go into a scene and there's like a shooting range or something like that, and
narratively they never really make sense either.
And they're so boring. And so we always try to put a big burden on ourselves of how do we train people while not letting them know they're being trained, and brevity is really important to that. So we had a bunch of art constraints on that, which also led to a bunch of writing constraints. And so those things were like, I don't even know if they were 30 seconds.
Yeah,
they were really short.
Seconds.
Yeah, 15 seconds long. We had to explain a whole plasmid in that period of time. And I think that was a good exercise because it also made the game, it forced us to be concise and to really explain what this thing was like that.
Throw objects at foes. You can even catch grenades and throw them back.
Сука. Так, стоп, раз, два, три, четыре, пять, шесть, семь, восемь, девять, 10.
Nailing the perfect marriage of story to gameplay is a science that many developers still struggle with today. BioShock has left an indelible mark on gaming narrative that can be seen and felt in many modern releases, but Irrational's motto remained from the beginning, don't start with the story, start with the gameplay. A lot of fans probably wonder about the process you go through in writing the story and the design for a game like BioShock. You've talked about how it evolves over time and what eventually ships is very different than your initial vision. Do you guys write like a script or a design document for the game and that becomes sort of the Bible that everyone drives towards, or do you iterate much more?
It's different for every game. Like System Shock 2, I went back to it recently. I wrote a design document, and we started that project in September, and the design document I saw was dated like October or something. So in a month, I wrote the design document, and it didn't change. A lot of it, got expanded upon, but the basic design really didn't change on that. Where on BioShock, I think it evolved in real time much more. We had a pretty substantial design shift, like a year before the ship date.
For BioShock?
BioShock, yeah. It got to be much more about the experience of being in Rapture than about being in your character sheet. And so the game evolved more towards that experiential kind of thing and making sure every idea was expressed in the world as well as just on your character sheet. So before you'd have a lot of things like, I'm doing fire damage or electrical damage, but that was sort of a number flying off ahead versus, the whole notion of there's barrels and you light them on fire and then you can pick them up and throw them.
But you'd have stats coming off characters and all that stuff?
Much more so.
Oh, really?
And that evolved, we did a design shift, but I don't know how well that got documented. I think we were moving so fast that we were just sort of changing things, laying down the tracks as we went right ahead of us. And the same with the screenplay, the screenplay there is no screenplay. It's a bunch of probably Excel files and fragments of Word documents that I'd write, and I'd go to recording sessions and I'd rewrite on the fly once I hear the actor perform, because once the actor takes on it, you listen to their voice and you say, what you wrote doesn't really matter. What is the right thing for this actor playing this role to be saying? So I tend to do a lot of rewriting in the session, and then you have a bug late at night where somebody says, oh, this doesn't make any sense, and you're like, oh God, and you have to write a new audio log and try to get the actor back in, or you figure out what's the best way to get this idea across? Yeah. And is it an audio log? Is it a poster on the wall? Is it a piece of text that pops up on the screen? And that's always dependent on how much time you have and what actor availability is. So, the plans sort of fall apart. I think we've worked on that a bunch since on the new project we're working on, where we are trying to document things a lot better and keep things a lot more logical, but the train was running so fast on BioShock that we just sort of...
Early on, we got the Andrew Ryan scene in, like we'd said before, and that was kind of like the keystone. We're going to put a lot of work into this, so this can't change. Everything that happens before or after that don't really involve a lot of departments working together to make a scene, those things are very malleable, and if you need to change audio logs to represent a story, if you need to add lines or take away lines, that's very doable. And I think for a while we even had text-to-speech.
We even did that, I remember for Infinite with Booker and Elizabeth and all their dialogue, and that really didn't work very well, because you'd have these dramatic scenes, and it'd be like, Elizabeth, we need to go to Comstock, and it just...
Yeah.
Just it was almost had no value as far as I was concerned.
Atlas radioed on ahead. Says you were looking for an invite to the fisheries. Nuts, I say. But if your heads up to the Warp Master's office and find old Peach a research camera, maybe I could manage an invite.
Ken has so much of, these games in his head, and you're sort of, you can keep it all straight, or try to, with all the different things and changes. But from the team perspective, Sean, I mean, because this is evolving and Ken's thinking in his head about how this all ties together, how does the team sort of keep up with, what the whole game is going to look like?
There's a lot of specifics that can change. For instance, Atlas used to have a Southern drawl.
Right.
And then, we recast to the Irish.
And we actually cast an actor, wrote the lines, did the whole thing, and realized that people hated that character and distrusted him from the first start. So we had to rewrite him, recast him, redo everything.
Yeah. From a team perspective, you kind of get a sense on which things are going to be really volatile and that you probably want to push off till later, because if you work on it now, it might change. Larger themes don't tend to change too much, meaning we knew we were in Rapture, we knew we had Big Daddies, we knew we had Little Sisters, we knew we had Splicers, we knew what the arc of the story was about Jack coming into Rapture, and the specifics of this radiolog versus that radiolog didn't really affect anyone outside the audio team at that time, because we could still build the environment. We still knew what the environment was. We still knew what the animations were. There are areas you learn just by working in the same space for a while that this scene, I'm not touching this yet because I know that it's going to get changed a lot. I think these themes are pretty nailed down, so I'm going to focus the team on getting these things done.
I won't leave you twisting in the wind. We're going to need to draw her out of hiding, but you're going to have to trust me.
The audio logs were, a great part of the game, and something that if you're a true fan, I mean, people really go in and listen to those and piece that all together. But I imagine there's a lot of work that goes into deciding, well, this is better for an audio log versus game dialogue, and there's the act of sort of cutting back and sort of saying, we need to be clear about what the narrative is for the game. What was that process like? I mean, the audio logs, were there things you added at the end, or were those, ideas that you had for the game, but then said, hey, maybe we'd demote these a little bit and make them audio logs?
As Sean was saying, there's sort of a hierarchy of expense that you have to face, and so any ideas you have to get across, especially as you start playing the game, you realize, well, this doesn't make sense, that doesn't make sense. You have to figure out how you can introduce that idea. And generally, as the train is moving, you try to think of cheaper and cheaper ways to get those ideas across. If it's less important, it goes to an audio log. If it's less important, it goes to a poster on the wall.
Well, there's also characters that you can bring in that have audio logs that aren't. Atlas, Tenenbaum, those are your big ones. You can bring in somebody to do a short, a few different audio logs. It's a character that some players may not even find, but it adds a little bit of depth to Rapture.
And it also, usually each character generally is about a certain idea, and we don't just sort of come up with characters, we have an idea problem that we need to solve, and so let's introduce a character who's this guy, and he will be the guy who sort of shepherds you through that idea.
Julie, my dear, I am trying to run a business here. You want to spend time with my honeybees? Well, I'm going to have to start charging you for the pleasure. If I come out one more time and find you lolling out there amongst my hives, I'm grabbing my shotgun. As to your question, yes, my days in beekeeping school are a blur. But I do seem to remember something about that enzyme you keep blabbing on about.
So as you're going through the game and, writing things, rewriting things, were there things with the original BioShock that you've always been surprised that more people didn't pick up on, or was there something that, a connection to a character you thought was really going to resonate with people, which, didn't? Anything like that?
No, it's the opposite. I was amazed, I don't know how you felt, but I was amazed how many people connected to the Would You Kindly stuff. Because I think it was when I wrote that speech, I don't think anybody on the team was like, oh my God, this is really this or that. And I don't think I really had any sense that people were going to connect to it. I think we ended up sort of over time finding more ways to support the notion throughout the game.
Yep.
And I don't think I really, until I heard Pat put together the revelation moment, where it's where you had all the bits that Atlas had said to you in the past building up, and then there was a visual that went along with that. That's when I realized it was going to be a really powerful moment. But even so, I still was did I think people were really going to connect to it or really even understand it? Because it's pretty out there. And that it was meta commentary too. I think that completely, like, I think I thought like, oh, it's kind of meta, cool. But people connected to it in a much bigger way.
Yeah, the choice and everything, and also just, being able to kind of roll back and think of all those other moments throughout the game. And so, a great revelation like that, they're few and far between in games where you sort of like, then you want to play it again, you're just like, oh wow, really, that does all make sense, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a team, we were definitely proud of what we had done. But up till that point, SWAT 4 was the biggest game that we worked on, and we had no expectation of that anybody would pick this up. Or even like BioShock cosplay. I remember the first cosplay I saw with a guy in the Big Daddy suit, and his little daughter was in the kitchen cabinet. I think that was the first one I saw. I was like, what? Whoa, people know this stuff? That's insane.
Yeah, people were building these outfits, and that only expanded with Infinite. I mean, that sort of went crazy with Infinite, with people cosplaying Elizabeth and Luteces and Booker. It meant a lot to people, and I don't think that's something we ever saw coming, and we're deeply grateful for it, because it's one thing to make a game and get good reviews and stuff like that. It's another thing to have things that people are having their weddings themed around it, and their tattoos and naming their children after characters. You can't plan for that, and I think the only way that could happen is if you just make something that you're deeply in love with and passionate about. I can say we were. It was something there's a lot of passion on the team about, but we didn't know people were going to take away what they did.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find it? Would you kindly find it? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan's office and kill the son of a bitch?
Part of the challenge with that, though, is when people love fiction so much and they dive into every word written in every audio log and try and connect all the fiction, make sure it all makes sense. Are there any things from that game that you sort of look back and say, like, oh wow, like we didn't explain this and we should have, or things that fans have misinterpreted over the years?
There are things we think that we did that should have or shouldn't have been in the game. Like I was never a fan of having two endings, and I think
that's what the publisher was asking you to sort of have a.
That was the one thing that 2K, and they were very hands off. That was the one thing they insisted on, and it's not something I really thought was a good idea, because they're still limited, even though they're multiple. They're still limited, and so that was something that we ended up doing. One of the endings was far better than the other one. I mean, there's no. It's clear that I was much more interested in the happier ending with the little sisters than I was with the nuclear submarine ending.
I'm sure part of it was the idea that if this game is, if you're making a choice throughout it, I'm sure when some people are like, oh well, then it has to be a payoff, right?
Right. Except the game was really about lack of choice. About not being a choice. So that always struck me as a tension that was weird. But look, at the end of the day, they were putting up a lot of money, and so I can't really complain. They weren't dictatorial at all during the development. So that was the one thing. But that's a game that I wouldn't have put the boss battle in, the final boss battle. Like we seem to end up doing that over and over and over again. Every time we start a project, I'm like, I'm never going to do that again. We're never going to do that again, and we end up doing it.
Right.
We're not good at boss battles, and that you're fighting that guy, and look, this is the naked dude. It just doesn't work.
Totally makes sense.
But and it works really pretty well up till then, but then it doesn't. It just doesn't work. That boss battle's silly.
Да, кстати, было так себе. Так, блять, потратить еще раз, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 час. Типа, скорее всего, потом. Сейчас надо собаку пойти погулять. Наверное, все на сегодня, да. Дальше уже будем перетекать на Good, смотреть мультики, да. Не, блин, почему интересно, на самом деле, да? А что я там про босса-то говорил? Ну я проходил на среднем, на стриме. Сегодня утром добежал ремастерит на... какая там сложность-то? На невозможном. Типа, было классно. Было интересно. Интересно даже... Блять, я пользоваться начал тониками, которые вообще, как бы, такие с виду хуёвые были, скажем, да? Те же, к примеру, эти лосы. Вот. полностью все эти исследования завершил. Тоже классно, пригодилось, оказывается. Турели можно просто подойти и взломать без этого. Без мини-игры. Тоже классно. Летучие эти боты тоже. Что-то там еще взломалось. Не помню ничего. Не, ну автоматы все, конечно, да, сложно было. Там за некоторые автоматы на предпоследних левелах предлагали брать, значит, за автозлом и выкуп за 480 баксов. 480 баксов, а с собой можно всего 500 таскать. Как бы классный выкуп такой. На все деньги. Вот. Тоже там. Прикольно. Но, типа, из-за того, что знал, где еще лежит, было легко. Даже несмотря на то, что там, ну, разница в уроне, скажем. И в количестве патронов поднимаемом. Вот. Так что, блин, BioShock классная игра, я не знаю, почему я раньше стеснялся играть в нее. Вернее, почему мне раньше до нее руки не дошли. Не знаю, как сложилось бы мое мнение, если бы я сначала купил вот этот, да, по предзаказу, вот тупо бахнул бы Infinite, потом бы начал играть в эти. Я бы, наверное, не знаю, плевался, хотя вряд ли. Настал бы этот момент, я бы все равно заново перепроходил бы всю эту хуйню. Вот, и завершал бы Infinite. Так что ладно. На этом все.